As I mentioned, you are joining us for the second part of Trauma and Resilience in Tribal Communities, presented by Caltrin. Our presenters this morning are again Amy Foster Wolferman and Veronica Willetta DeCrane of the National Native Children's Trauma Center. And they are going to go ahead. Oh, a couple of housekeeping points actually before we get started. As we did yesterday, this is an interactive meeting, so you have the opportunity to have your camera on. If you are in an environment where you can do so, we do welcome and encourage that. There will be opportunities to ask questions during today's training. So you can raise a hand. We will recognize you. You can also put questions in the chat if you're more comfortable. You can use the chat for discussion as well. If there are comments that you want to make, please feel free. And then we will be doing a couple of breakout rooms. If you find yourself in a breakout room that for whatever reason, you're the only person, or you're in a group that maybe, there's always that one breakout room where you're like, what's up with the 3 screens that have no one? What's going on? You have the opportunity in that breakout button to leave the room and go back to the main session and let us know. And we'll absolutely find you a group. So don't feel that if you're in a breakout room that doesn't have participation, that you need to stay there. Come back and talk to us and we can help problem solve. Similarly, if you're having trouble getting to your breakout room, let us know and we will help you get there. We want to make sure that this is an opportunity both for learning, but also for connection. So we're available to problem solve throughout the training. I am going to turn this over now to Veronica and Amy.
Great. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's good to be back today. Good to see folks rejoining. I know that there'll be some who were with us yesterday and maybe some new folks too, who were not. And my name again is Amy Foster Wolferman. My colleague here today is Veronica Willetta DeCrane, and we'll both be covering some different pieces here. I'm going to start by finishing up some things that we left off with yesterday. And so on the screen here today, you see a table with some rows and columns and colors. This is really a representation of some work done by Dr. Bruce Perry, who's the director of the Child Trauma Academy. And as you can see across these rows, we have on the top row the hyperarousal continuum, the middle row representing the dissociative continuum, and on the bottom we have the internal state, kind of that mental state. And so we started talking yesterday about how if you look on the bottom row, those different columns of calm, alert, alarm, fear, and terror, and thinking about which mental state we do our best thinking in and have our best ideas and our most creative ideas. And we came up with more likely in a state of alert or calm. And so Dr. Perry talks about that too. And really yesterday when we talked about when we go into the fight, flight, freeze mode, if our hand is our brain, we're the prefrontal cortex are our top fingers. We flip our lids when we go into that fight, flight, freeze mode. And we're really obviously not in that state of calm or alert. And so thinking about our youth who may be living in kind of amongst more stressful or more chaotic environments, experiencing some trauma, we guessed yesterday what mental state a child going through this experience in their lives, what mental state might they wake up in the morning before anything's even happened, just opening their eyes. And there were some guesses around potentially waking up in a state of alarm. And that's what Dr. Perry has found in his work, is that oftentimes our kids who are experiencing trauma and traumatic stress, they tend to have their baseline heart rate tends to be higher along with their baseline blood pressure. And so looking back at this table along the hyperarousal continuum, which is really of the fight, flight, freeze, the fight response, this child may be waking up in a state of resistance. And so it doesn't take very much to have maybe a trauma reminder or trigger in the environment to push them from a state of alarm to a state of fear, and then maybe potentially to a state of terror. And so then what that might look like behaviorally, we might see some resistance when a child is first entering our space. A youth that we're supporting or working with may already be resistant before they even get to us. And it might be not take much of anything to then push them to a state of fear, which then becomes defiance, or a state of terror, which then becomes aggression. And we know that a lot of our kids who display this kinds of behavior outwardly, we see that there's a struggle. We see that there's something happening that they may need some support with. But along the other end of the spectrum, we have the dissociative continuum of the fight, flight, freeze. It's often the freezers that tend to dissociate. And so when this child wakes up in the morning in a state of alarm, nothing has yet happened, they appear to be compliant. They act in a compliant manner because they don't want to rock the boat or draw attention to them. And so this child might come to us and we don't notice that there's anything going on or that there's a struggle. And it might not take much for this child to be reminded of a trauma by something in the environment. We talked about triggers yesterday, maybe a sight, a smell, maybe being too close into this child's space, proximity, for them to then move from a state of alarm to a state of fear, which then moves them from being very compliant to then dissociating or checking out. And so we might see this as, trying to engage with a child. Maybe we get too close in their space and that's a trigger for them. And so they don't respond. They look to be sort of checked out or spaced out. And that can be really difficult to interpret and understand. So I think it's really helpful just to be looking at the behaviors that we're seeing in the youth that we're supporting, and always trying to be curious about what's underlying that behavior. And sometimes, as you can see in this chart, especially with those impacted by trauma, it's fear-based, and it doesn't take much to kind of shift that mental state, that internal state. And so the whole goal of trauma-informed care and approach is to shift these youth that are walking around in maybe a highly stressed mode on the verge of going into fight, flight, freeze, that state of alarm and fear, down to a state of calm and alert. And how we can do that is by setting up supportive, safe environments. And we'll talk about some strategies there as we move into the next section. So the next thing we want to do is, it's our final scenario. And this is a boy named Damien. And the scenario is on the screen. He is the son of Sherry and the grandson of Reggie, who we talked about yesterday. So I'm going to put into the chat Damien's scenario. We'll take a few minutes to read it. And again, just like yesterday, we will get into breakout rooms, take a few moments to read the scenario, and then we will be projecting the screen with a couple of questions for you and your group to address. So think about what are some of the behaviors that we're seeing with Damien that may be somewhat challenging or problematic, and then also be thinking about how these behaviors might be linked or tied to his experiences of trauma. All right, welcome back, and thank you for taking the time to participate in that activity. We would love to hear from you. If you wouldn't mind maybe sharing in the chat, or if you prefer to unmute and share verbally some of the things that your group talked about. What were some of the behaviors that you were seeing exhibited in Damien's behavior? And how might those have been linked to traumas that he's experienced? What would you all come up with? Again, feel free to just use the chat.
I'm sorry. Our group, for some reason, I got kicked out. I think it's my Wi-Fi. I don't know what's going on.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but I didn't get to hear anything they said and stuff, or if they talked, our group and stuff. But I just wanted to share just what I read and stuff.
Yeah, thank you.
About about the past traumas, I think it is linked. It's kind of like, again, those cycles from history of trauma from his family that kind of dwindled down. And as I read the story, sounds like there's a multiple things happening with this young man, with the acting out. And I think it's sad though, but what I read, it was a number of abuse happening for him. One, he was afraid of the dark, right? And then that acting out at school with his classmates, destroying things, and then the principal put him in, didn't wanted to put him alone in a room, and he acted out on that. So to me, it tells me that there's so much trauma going on with this little guy, that he needs help.
Right.
He needs
Right.
help, and so my apologies. That was about the gist I got from reading that.
Great. No, thank you, Mary. I appreciate
Yeah.
that. Yeah. We have some others too. Forrest sharing about beyond concerning behavior from Damien. There's a lot of places where the teacher and principal are dropping the ball, at least from this short blurb from Damien, stealing, drawing gruesome images and struggling with transitions between computers and class time, right? That can be very concerning, and maybe they're not seeing how important that is to follow up with. Leah, he suggests sharing that received comfort from the computer, same as receiving the phone from the mom, right? That might be a comfort connection. Lisa's sharing he was left in the car by the mother, and then the principal was putting him alone in the room, right? That could be very easily a trauma reminder for him. And Jenny is saying behavior is communication that is used when not taught or provided the appropriate tools to handle a situation. Yeah, that's a great one to wrap this up with, because I think what we're trying to do is really just be mindful and aware and become curious about behavior. What is underlying this behavior? What might be activating it, setting it off? What might they be seeking or trying to avoid? Are they seeking safety? Are they avoiding danger? What is happening underneath? And always trying to look underneath the surface. So thank you all for taking the time to think about this family as we put all the pieces together and sort of the impact of trauma over time. We are now going to shift to our next piece that Veronica will start us with. So I will stop share, and thank you all again.
Okay, we're going to start off with the video, and we've been watching this video from, we started it yesterday, and today we're going to continue, and we're really going to tie all the pieces together. We've been talking about since we started the different trauma types, and we started with historical trauma, and then we talked about adverse childhood experiences. And now we've been just kind of going over some of the trauma responses and behaviors that we may see in individuals that are impacted and struggling with the effects of trauma. So we're now going to be watching this, continuing the video, which will help us kind of tie all those things together. Let me go ahead and cue it up for us.
It keeps people at bay. It protects you.
Now we know what happens to brain development when a child experiences adversity and how that affects behavior. But how does adversity lead to negative health and social outcomes, as the ACE study showed? Earlier in the program, we talked about how participants in the ACE study with 4 or more ACEs were several times more likely to develop negative health and social outcomes than a person with 0 ACEs. You can see some of those health and social outcomes here. But how do we get there? how do we get from a high ACE score to liver disease, to coronary heart disease, to obesity? Having a high ACE score increases the risk of mental illnesses like anxiety or depression. And the toxic stress response affects the areas of the brain in charge of impulse control and judgment, as well as the pleasure and reward center. So it makes sense that someone with a high ACE score would be more likely to engage in high-risk behavior as a way to cope with that anxiety or depression. How would a child, like child A, cope with anxiety or depression? Salvador Sanchez Strawbridge used to be in a gang during his childhood. Now, he's the community outreach specialist for the Santa Rosa Violence Prevention Partnership. He explains how he coped with his unaddressed trauma as a child.
In my childhood, I had some traumatic experiences, and because I didn't know how to deal with those situations in my life, throughout my life, I put things inside of me to make me feel better. So first it was candy and toys and things like that, and then it was gangs and girls and drugs. Gangs are wraparound services based on conditional love. They literally will give you a false sense of everything you don't have. If you don't have, for me, I was half Irish, half Mexican, so I didn't understand who I was. I didn't have identity, so they gave me identity. You're gonna be part of this so you can feel okay. Like I can be okay because I'm scared, I'm alone, I'm in fear, I don't want to be picked on, I want to be powerful, I want to be somebody, I want to be seen. A lot of kids don't feel like they're seen. These kids are joining gangs because they lost hope, because there's something that's not right for them. They don't feel that anybody cares. They've lost hope on society. The jobs that they see are jobs, not careers. The school system that they go to doesn't tell their history or where they come from, or has anybody that looks like them in their books. So they can sense it. They can sense that the society doesn't care about them.
This explanation can also be applied to other coping methods, like smoking or intravenous drug use. Smoking is a way of self-medicating that decreases feelings of anxiety and depression. You can see in this graph that the more ACEs someone has, the more likely they are to smoke, and the more likely they are to develop lung disease. And HIV can be transmitted through intravenous drug use, another way of self-medicating. More ACEs means someone is more likely to use intravenous drugs as a coping mechanism, and more likely to develop related health problems. So, if someone smokes, uses drugs, or engages in gang activity as a way of coping with trauma, with all factors considered, these are actually adaptive behaviors. They are available solutions to the difficulties that accompany adversity.
But it turns out that even if you don't engage in any high-risk behavior, you're still more likely to develop heart disease or cancer. High doses of adversity not only affect brain structure and function, they affect the developing immune system, developing hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed.
High doses of adversity affect how our DNA is read and transcribed? What exactly does that mean? DNA is in our cells. It's the blueprint for who we are. We receive half of our DNA from our biological mother and half from our biological father. And DNA is made up of genes, sections of DNA that have specific instructions for cells. These instructions tell cells what to be and what to do. Here's where ACEs comes in. Recent research indicates that stress can actually influence how cells read those instructions on our genes. And this can negatively impact how our cells work. And because DNA is passed from biological parent to child, these changes to our genes can be passed down from generation to generation. Genetics can shape a child's development, but the adults in their environment can too.
We are the stress regulation system for those infants, right?
I'll go ahead and stop it there. If you're welcome on your own time, if you want to, you'll be getting a copy of these slides if you want to finish that video from ACE's Connection, but it's a really good, provides a lot of really good background around adverse childhood experiences and its impacts on individuals throughout their life. So we'll go ahead and move forward. So we saw in the video that there's all these factors that kind of contribute to an individual's experience and how they're impacted by trauma and how that affects them in their life and leads to some adaptive behaviors that can become maladaptive. And so that's at an individual level. But yesterday we also talked about how there are community level and system level traumas that can be occurring in a person's life that also contribute to their poor health outcomes. And this is a really helpful graphic that just kind of helps us think about how these things are all connected. So yesterday we talked about historical trauma and how things that are happening to the community and within the community creates some adverse community environment. So we talked about how historical traumatic events have led to some of the poor economic conditions on reservations and in tribal communities. We also talked about how they've led to kind of the underfunding of service systems. So some of these adverse community environments that many tribal communities are faced with is stemming from historical trauma. So we can actually think about it in terms of this visual here, how historical trauma is actually in the soil. It's the soil in which some of the other traumatic experiences that children and families go through are rooted in. So the tree representing that family and the families in our communities, and how they're rooted in these community environments. And so they're kind of contributing to some of the individual trauma experiences that we've been talking about. And so I think that's really important for us to think about how they all connect and how they all relate to one another. But one of the things with this visual, as I'm sure some of you may be farmers, some of you may be growing your own garden and such, that you know that you can actually improve the soil. There's things that you can do to take care of the soil of your garden, of your farm, that actually helps to improve what is produced there. And so that's similar, in a similar vein as the video was getting into. There's some things that we can do that actually helps to prevent traumatic experiences, helps to intervene, and also helps to heal trauma. So that's what we want to focus on today. But I just want us to kind of think about this in terms of how it pertains to tribal communities, because historical trauma is a really huge influencing factor in families and what it is that they're dealing with today. So we know that historical trauma has caused a lot of loss in tribal communities. We know that it has led to kind of some of the loss of healing practices that have been used to help families and individuals heal from trauma, help them to live a well-balanced life, helped with their well-being, spiritual, physical, emotional, mental well-being. And so some of that has been limited in terms of what an individual has been able to access. So we kind of think about Reggie and how when he returned to his community, some of those healthy coping mechanisms, some of those ways in which he could heal from the trauma that he experienced in boarding school was actually not there for him, because many of the people that he would have learned that from and reconnected to that through they actually passed away, or he felt not connected in his community. And so what that led to was just him having some maladaptive coping mechanisms, right? He was he was trying to figure out how to cope with everything that he had went through. And so he did engage in substance abuse, and he did struggle with substance dependency. He dealt with some of the poor interpersonal relations in terms of just he didn't have good relations with his wife. He didn't have good relations with his daughter. So we kind of see that happening throughout the scenarios that we've been looking at. And of course, we also looked at how, today, some of the studies that have been done in tribal communities around adverse childhood experiences actually shows us that there is a high prevalence of adverse childhood experiences and trauma in general across the lifespan that is occurring within tribal communities. And so we see that some of this maladaptive coping mechanisms that with the lack of healthy resources for coping and individuals then turning to some unhealthy ways of coping is leading to even more trauma within those the communities the tribal communities that we're serving. So this is just a visual of that. We often see this image here beginning with adverse childhood experiences, but we also wanted to make sure that we included the historical trauma impacts and how that leads to some of the social conditions in which families raise their children in, and then some of the adverse experiences that happen as a result of some of those adverse community environments. And then as we have been learning about, some of the impacts, the brain science that we covered, and then the impacts of trauma on development, that really starts to have an impact on children's development. And that leads to some of the social, emotional, and cognitive impairments that we may be seeing with some of the young people in our tribal communities, with our tribal youth. And then, of course, there is that component of just adopting maladaptive behaviors that are putting their health at risk. And we heard from Dr. Nadine Burke that even if individuals do not adopt those types of behaviors, they're still seeing an impact of ACEs on their health outcomes. So we're seeing how that has led to disease and disability and some of the social ills that are occurring in our communities. And unfortunately, we are seeing that in a lot of tribal communities, the lifespan is cut short. There's early death that is often experienced. The average age that people are dying is actually pretty low compared to the rest of the population. And so I think that's really important for us to understand that all of these things are not just didn't just happen out of nowhere. There's a history, a historical context that has created some of these experiences for tribal peoples. And so we're in the business of trying to intervene. I know that you guys are all in that business as well, of trying to intervene at these different points along this path, trying to prevent some of this from happening. Some of this, even though we know that there's a high risk of this happening for tribal youth, we are concerned with making sure that that isn't the case. So I've been talking about tribal communities and how all of our learning around trauma and its impacts has been pertains to these communities. We're hoping to hear from you. So we're going to go ahead and put you guys back in your breakout rooms, and we're going to ask you to think about some of the trauma responses or maybe to you, they're more, you see them more as maladaptive behaviors, but they could be linked, they could be trauma responses in your communities. What is it that you see? What's happening? What are some of those emotional trauma responses, spiritual, behavioral, cognitive, mental trauma responses in your communities, especially as it pertains, if you're already working with tribal communities and tribal youth and tribal families, what are you seeing occurring with them? So we're just going to give you a few minutes to talk about your own context. All right, it looks like everyone is back. Welcome back. I hope you guys had a good discussion. I'm really interested to hear what you guys were able to share in that time. So you're welcome to share in the chat what you guys were able to talk about in terms of the trauma responses in your community and what you see happening. You're also welcome to unmute yourself and share verbally as well. All right, we have a comment in the chat. So in Paula, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Multiple systems and lack of communication or resource impact people and their level of hope to move forward and heal. So that's what you're seeing in your community. Teresa talked about lack of resources and how many of the communities are experiencing the same type of multiple symptoms of community members. Interesting. And we talked about, Jen says, we talked about substance use, mental health, and homelessness in our community, also about the silos that are starting to be broken down as people learn that working together to serve families has a greater impact. That's awesome. I'm glad you guys were able to see some of that happening in your communities. Marilee, some emotions I am noticing is anger. There's a lot of distrust in the community. Yeah, we often hear that with trauma. One of the trauma responses emotionally is tends to be anger. Absolutely. And Forrest, there's a lot of drug use, homelessness, intimate partner violence, domestic violence in his area. And Amy, did you want to share what you shared in the chat?
Sure. Yeah, that's one community in particular that we've been working with for several years, and kind of a recurring conversation is around lateral violence, lateral oppression. Not that those terms were used for a while, it was just examples of how people are really turning against each other. When someone's maybe trying to do something helpful, gets put down or judged by others, a lot of criticism, really that sense of trying to hold each other down, and kind of making one another, the enemy. And that's been, it's been a difficult for the community, trying to shift that too. And we've talked about lateral love and lateral kindness. How do we shift that perception and what we do and work really intentionally to shift towards lateral love?
Absolutely. And that's a lot of the work of trauma-informed care, as we're kind of naming all of these trauma responses in our community. Part of the work of applying a trauma lens is that we recognize that these may be trauma responses, that they're related to the effects of historical or community system or individual trauma experiences that are happening within that community. And so we are starting to see some of the behaviors and some of the signs in this way, so that they're connected to trauma. And that's part of the work of having providing trauma-informed care is seeing that link to trauma histories, to past trauma experiences, and then so that we can have a better response in terms of how do we then respond when someone is behaving a certain way, when someone is expressing anger. What are some ways that we can provide support to those individuals in our community? So Stephanie is sharing barriers to proper access to medical care can exacerbate family dynamics at home and can create family separation. Parents aren't able to have proper tools to deal with children's mental wellness. This is rooted in systemic racism within medical institutions and in schools. Children then exhibit detriment in mental health, like depression and anxiety, and children can then be sent to outside facilities to deal with untreated mental health issues, and this disrupts family ties. Absolutely, Stephanie. Thank you for pointing that out. There is a lot of systemic racism that is causing some of the inequities in communities, particularly communities of color. Paula is saying, as it relates to spirituality, some folks lose connection due to possibly being used against them and loss of trust in spiritual or religious beliefs. Absolutely, that can occur. We've done a session before with one tribal community around just the impact of spiritual trauma, religious trauma, and how that can affect a community and individuals needing support and recovering from that as well. Thank you guys so much for sharing. Please feel free to keep sharing with one another and responding to one another in the chat about how this information is making sense in terms of what's happening in your community. We'll go ahead and move forward. So as I kind of mentioned, we're really trying to change the conversation from what's wrong with people, why are they so horrible, why is this kid so bad, to actually trying to think about the function of behaviors. So Amy talked a little bit about this in some of the trauma responses that she talked about, and how children can be seeking protection, and they do so in different ways, right? They do so sometimes in the video, a gentleman called it, they are volatile and they are aggressive because they're trying to keep themselves safe. They may be unresponsive to you and because there's a lack of trust and they're trying to keep themselves safe, and that's all due to their past experiences of trauma. So our roles in our and whenever roles that we have in our organizations, part of providing trauma-informed care in that role is really to ask what the function of the behavior is. So when someone when you make a home visit and you're seeing a lot of difficult behaviors, when somebody is coming into your office, when you're getting a lot of referrals because of children or adults' behaviors, really asking about what some of the function of that behavior may be. And so it could be that they're trying to stay safe, they're trying to avoid getting hurt, they're trying to find a way to cope with some of the trauma reminders, the trauma responses that they're dealing with. So they're trying to maybe cope in maladaptive ways. So just kind of thinking about some of the interactions that you're having and how you're viewing your clients' behaviors, and then trying to move towards recognizing that whether we know the details of people's trauma histories or not, we can try to understand that whatever behaviors we are seeing that may be related to trauma, past traumas, is actually a way for these individuals to cope. And it may be ways that they learned. Sometimes they learn to cope from, from the adults in their life that maybe didn't provide the best examples for them. And so they're learning how to cope, just like we heard from Sherry and we heard from Damien. Some of their ways of coping may not have been the healthiest. And so sometimes individuals are doing the best they can to, in whatever it is that they're struggling with, to cope with what it is that they're struggling with, to cope with that overwhelming sense of fear and helplessness and terror, to cope with some of those trauma reminders that they're having. All right, so I'm going to pass it over to Amy, and she is going to move into this next section on resilience.
Thanks, Veronica. And thanks to everyone for participating in that discussion. It's really helpful to be able to take these ideas, these concepts, and actualize them, think about how they apply to our own settings. So yeah, we're going to shift towards thinking about resilience and moving into what we can do to help promote building protective factors and supporting development of resiliency in those that we work with and ourselves. So we all know people who've lived through traumas, right? And they've been able to manage or overcome these experiences of adversity. So just think for a minute, what are some of the qualities, some of their mindsets or beliefs, their habits or behaviors? And it might be yourself or just someone you know. What are some of those qualities, habits, beliefs, behaviors that seem to give people the strength to overcome trauma? And feel free to share that in the chat. What is it that gets people through? What is it about themselves, what they do, what they think, that get them through? A positive attitude. Yeah, that mindset, that positive attitude. Asking for help. What a skill is that? Being connected to others, recognizing our own internal strengths. Absolutely. Build belonging, find community. So connecting with others, having people they can turn to, having a role model, determination to thrive, not just survive. Great. Having a support system, persistence and accepting the situation, confident support systems, facing the trauma and beginning to heal from it, doing things you love, finding a good support network. Awesome. Connections to culture, helping others. Nice. These are great examples. Absolutely. These are all of this is a description of what resilience is. Thanks for sharing those ideas. What there we go. So there is a definition of resilience that was developed by Harvard University Center for the Developing Child. And it says that resilience is a positive, adaptive response in the face of significant adversity. It's basically getting knocked down and being able to bounce back. And so where does this come from? Where does our resilience come from? It's not a fixed characteristic that we either have or we don't have, right? And there's not a set amount of resilience that we can use up. They found through research that it comes from a number of different places, including, just as you all have mentioned, our environments, so that the resources and the supports that we have around us to help us that we can turn to. It also can come from, there's a genetic aspect, it can come from our genes. Some of us have a with genes that give us a stronger predisposition towards resilience. And it can also come from our experiences, right? We can learn, what's worked in different situations that can help us develop an understanding of what to do in difficult times. So some of us might have more of a genetic predisposition towards resilience, or we might have more access to resources in our environments than others. Regardless, resilience can be developed, it can be taught, it can be strengthened and built upon. And our young ones are especially capable of growing resilience because, they're still growing their brains and bodies and still developing. So there's a lot of hope with our young ones, but even for us older folk too. We can continue to develop our own resilience by engaging in these different practices that support resilience. But it can also erode, and we do want to pay attention to that. So if we're not actively engaging in activities, seeking help when we need it, turning to our support systems, it can actually erode. So it is something that we need to be mindful of and work to maintain. So we also want to point out that in addition to adverse childhood experiences, we of course also have positive childhood experiences, right? And it's just been more recently that there's been researchers examining the impacts of those positive childhood experiences on youth and adults. And in 2019, there was a team of researchers, Dr. Christina Bethel and some of her colleagues, who found this association between positive childhood experiences and adult mental health and adult relationship health among adults who had experienced adverse childhood experiences, regardless of how many ACEs they had. So the questions that are here were a part of that study that you see on the screen. And they found that if you have a lot of adversity and a lot of positive childhood experiences, you are less likely to suffer the consequences of the ACEs or the trauma because those positive experiences buffer that negative. But if you have no positive childhood experiences and just a few ACEs, the impacts of the ACEs are much more likely to impact you and appear. So that those positive experiences really can be that buffer for more adversity. And there's been a number of other studies starting about 2014 to present in this area, if you are curious to look up some additional studies. But it's great to see this newer focus on the impacts of positive experiences, because our society, we really tend to focus more on our problems and deficits and adversities, and we often overlook what's going well or what we can learn from what is going well. So it's a good direction to see this new research. But we want to take a look now at how we can help foster resilience. But if we think about the Reggie and the Sherry scenarios, both of them were engaged in some unhelpful thinking about each other, kind of about their family members' ability to be resilient. And so, for example, Reggie kicked Sherry out of the house, and he justified this action by saying, "Oh, it might do her some good." Sherry would sometimes lash out at her son Damien by saying his problems were due to his character or his genes, and he's just called him no good. So what is it about these moments in these scenarios that is unhelpful? How they're perceiving one another, how they're naming each other's ability and or lack thereof. And maybe if you could share in the chat or verbally, if you prefer, what is it about these scenarios that is really unhelpful in terms of the way they're perceiving one another or calling each other out? Any thoughts about that? Thank you, Marilee. Maybe thinking that they have to do it all alone, right? Oh, excuse me. Right, really putting it all on them, as if taking them out of the context of it's not necessarily just about them, but there are other factors, right? Blaming does not help, right? Suppressing feelings that are related to all of this. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think you're really getting right at it. It's just that and it's really putting the blame on the individuals themselves and taking the whole situation out of context, right? That it's just about the individual's behaviors, but not about the past experiences that really led to these behaviors. Monica sharing their shame by shaming the next generation, right? Just transferring that shame on themselves right back at the other person. Understanding that going through something implies there is, and going through something implies that there's another side. Absolutely. You're not stuck there. Right. So I think it's a kind of important there, here's another one, creating triangulations and wedges within the family unit, right? You know, when you're name calling, putting down, blaming, that's exactly what's happening. Saying it is what it is sounds like you're hopeless, right? You're stuck. There's no chance for changing, shifting, building resilience. Excellent. Yeah. So, I think, you know, we can kind of think about some of these cliches, right? We've all heard people praise others for, you know, you pulled yourself up by your bootstraps. That's great. You've really worked hard to tough it out. You got past your struggles, you know, and they're really cliches that might have a place in some conversations, but can be harmful in the context of trauma and also in the context of resilience. You know, we'd never expect someone that's experienced severe trauma or have a severe trauma history to just decide one day to be positive and to be able to maintain that positivity, right? So encouraging people in this way, just, you know, step up, can make them feel worse about themselves, right, than they already do, and promote a sense of hopelessness. You know, why can't I just get over this like others seem to be able to, right? So it could be dangerous to be using that kind of perspective or that approach. Positive responses to adversity tend to happen because of a mix, right, of resources that people have in their lives and the way that these resources interact with their own traits and experiences. So based on a lot of different research, there are a common group of factors that have been identified that make people more likely to be resilient. And these are what we call protective factors. And so having them certainly doesn't eliminate the effects of trauma, but it can soften the effects and provide some stability in the face of some difficult and stressful times. And when we have, when several protective factors are in place, we can really thrive, as somebody mentioned earlier, in spite of the exposure to the more severe traumatic events. So we're going to look at those next. And the first one will be no surprise to anyone, but relationships. And research has shown over and over and over again in all different contexts that the single most important protective factor for children who experience trauma is having at least one solid, trusting relationship with a supportive adult. And this could be a parent, a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, a neighbor, a coach, a teacher, and really anyone can fill that role. It's not who the person is or what their role is, as much as the characteristics of the relationship. So the support needs to be unconditional. So even if I screw up, I know you will still be there for me. You're going to accept my mistakes and you're going to support me in learning from them. Also, the person needs to be stable, you know, or show stability. So you can turn to that person and they will consistently be there. Not necessarily available, 24/7 access, but create a time for you when they're able to be there for you. And very opposite of 1 minute I support you and the next I want nothing to do with you, right? They're stable. You can always turn to them. And then we need to be able to trust that person. So I know that you're not going to harm me. I know that you are someone that will protect me if I need it. So just knowing that person is there. And this kind of relationship is really, it helps to insulate a person from who is experiencing trauma from the effects of that trauma. They might still be dealing with traumatic issues, but with a trusting relationship, the effects might not be as disruptive or toxic. And it provides, this relationship can provide a structure. It's a place a child can go to get that support that allows them to build positive skills rather than fall into maybe more unhealthy coping strategies. And so really healing after trauma can begin to occur when we see that there are actually people we can trust, because trauma is so often related to that disrupted relationship. So if we start to be able to see that people who make promises, they actually can keep them, and that when they say they will not hurt us, they don't, they protect us. So what I want you to do now is just take a moment and think of who that person, maybe there are more than one, but one that comes to mind for you. Who is that person that you could really trust? They were there for you unconditionally. Who was it in your life? But maybe in the chat, name who that person was for you and one characteristic of that person. Just kind of get them in our minds. Think of one of our greatest protective factors, relationships that we've had that have gotten us through. Who has that been for you? And for me, it was my grandma. I spent a lot of time with my grandma when I was young. We have a couple of moms, grandmas, lots of moms. Always listened. That was a characteristic. Unconditional brother, parents, unconditional love. Dad. Some past teachers. That's great. Siblings, brother, grandma, aunt, grandpa. I think it's good to reflect on this and what kind of healing we received over the years from these supports that we have. And then also to kind of stop and reflect on the relationships that we're developing with those that were maybe youth that we're supporting. Are we that person for them? Do we provide that unconditional love and support? Are we consistent with them and stable? Are we there to protect them? I mean, we could very much simply by having a relationship with this child be that strong protective factor for them. All right, well, thank you for sharing and reflecting. Along with that, talking about relationships, we did want to share a trauma-informed strategy that relates to relationship, and that is really the importance of the care provider maintaining their own affect, like really having a sense of our own level of stress, our ability to be calm, to maintain that calm, to be stable for that child. When it's such a powerful, if we can be present in that way in a stable and calm manner, it can be so powerful with a child who may be sort of experiencing some traumatic stress or just becoming really dysregulated and having a difficult moment. And so maintaining that control can really be powerful. And it's also not only maybe helping a child in a moment or youth in the moment to calm, but it's also very much modeling some of the skills that we're trying to teach, right? That we can, even if there's a difficult situation or scenario happening with us and around us, we can maintain our calm. And there's so much safety in that. And I think a part of that is it could be difficult when we're supporting youth who have more challenging behaviors. We talked a bit about maybe some aggressive behaviors or defiant behaviors, or children who really check out and shut down and are non-responsive. And all of that can be kind of confusing, hard to understand. It can be frustrating for us. And sometimes we might take that behavior that we're dealing with personally. I think a piece of this is always going back to understanding the why. And Veronica mentioned that again. Why might this child be acting in this way? Does it have anything to do with me? You know, most of the time, these more challenging behaviors might be happening with us, but they're very rarely about us. Even if we were like the trigger or trauma reminder, it's something to do with the child. And so if we can take that step back and like, this child is having a difficult moment, it's not about me. The best thing I can do, the greatest gift I can give right now in this moment is to maintain my own calm. And so just thinking through strategies of, you know, in the pocket, in the moment strategies of how I can do that, how I can maintain my calm. For a lot of us, I know for me, when I was actively teaching a busy classroom and having a lot of different behaviors, positive self-talk, like it's going to be okay, I can handle this, along with some deep breathing, is a really helpful strategy. But really depersonalizing that behavior, maintaining the calm, staying in control, and being open to sit with this difficult behavior. That's kind of that emotional container. I'm here for you. We can handle this. I'm going to help you regulate. Can be so powerful. Does anyone have any strategies or tips for how you can maintain that calm in those more difficult moments? I'd love to hear some ideas of how you can do that. And while you're thinking, I think in addition, you know, to best be able to maintain that calm in those difficult moments, it's really helpful to practice engaging the calm, maintaining the calm on a sort of long-term basis, that ongoing self-care, because then we're more familiar with being able to help ourselves to relax and maintain our control. Any ideas? How do you maintain control? Keep yourself in check. How do you even notice when you maybe are starting to feel a little bit of stress? Sometimes we don't step back to notice that we even are stressed. Meditate. Yeah. You know, maybe that's something we can do on a regular basis that can help us in those more difficult moments. Thank you, Jamie. Noticing often helps me to start calming down, right? That key is first to notice it, so then we can do something, engage in something that helps calm. Connect with a friend. Thank you, Alba.
For me, can I just speak? I was going to type it in, but I'll just speak out. For me, I've learned to just kind of really listen to my body, feel my emotions. You know, if things are, you know, especially with my kiddos, sometimes, you know, if things are making me upset, you know, I've learned to just, you know, learn how my body is reacting to what's going on and decide on what it is I need to do, whether it's, you know, explain to my child, you know, I need a moment right now. I need to just take a quick break. Maybe you can take a quick break and just kind of, we'll get back on this, you know, and we'll talk about it. So I've learned to just kind of feel, you know, the heart's pumping and you start to feel a little bit of the ears, you know, get red and what have you. So I just learned to just read my body a little bit and understand it and feel what I'm feeling in the moment and decide what it is I need to do in the moment. You know what I mean? So whether that be take a breath, remove myself, go for a drive, go outside, cook, whatever makes me feel better to help me calm. So that way we can go back and talk about things calmly and, you know, deal with what the situation might be.
Yeah, that's excellent. That noticing it and then just saying it out, you know what, I need a moment. And that's, you know, really modeling that, you know, it's okay. Sometimes we do get a little dysregulated, but there are things we can do to get ourselves back in control. So you're regulating yourself and you're modeling how to do that for your youth. Some other ideas, self-care walks or runs, regulating with other activity, calm music, all very excellent strategies. Thank you so much for sharing. So another example, I think that's related to that relationship piece is really intentionally working to provide, to notice when a child is engaging in something something that there maybe a skill that they're trying to learn, or, you know, just anything that we notice that is going well, and comment on that, acknowledge that. A lot of our kids impacted by trauma have experienced a minimal amount of positive attention and a lot more punitive or negative attention. And they may come to expect this. And, really receiving negative attention is, better than receiving no attention. So we may often see that. And so we can really help change these patterns of thinking and behaving by offering an increased amount of positive attention. And the thing is, it may take some time for some of our kids with trauma histories to really trust that when we're saying these positive, kind things to them, that we mean it, because maybe they've been heard those things before and it really wasn't true, led to maybe some further harm. So it may take time, but positive feedback, with consistency and patience they can begin to accept it and start to internalize it. And it can contribute to their feelings of self-esteem and self-worth. And, when used in response to engaging in skills that we're trying to support, it can actually end up increasing their engagement in those skills that they're working on and learning. And it's a simple strategy, but it really, we forget to do it when we get busy. And so it really does take that intention. And when we're providing it, we want to keep in mind that we want to be real specific and not just very general. Good job, nice work, yay, right on. Those things are great, but to really be specific about what it is that we're commenting. And then, just doing so can create a positive environment and doing so with sincerity. Right. So before we move on to the next, I just want to have everybody write in the chat a positive feedback statement that maybe you have recently used, or just create one that is sincere and specific about a youth that you have supported, something that you've been able to say to a youth that you've been trying to support. And one I can think of one is just, I so appreciate that you made it here today. I so enjoy you being with us today. But just these simple, positive feedback statements can let the child know that you acknowledge them, you see them, you appreciate them. Thank you for washing the dishes without being asked. Nice. You've worked really hard on this. I can see that. You're doing a great job in session together. I like how important it is. You always try to do the right thing. I was proud of her. She hadn't heard that before, right? Maybe these are things that our kids have not heard or experienced. So it can really help to boost that self-esteem and self-worth. I like the way you shared your feelings and your contributions to the discussion strengthen all of our knowledge. Great. Thank you for sharing these. Another protective factor that we're going to discuss is having a sense of mastery over our own lives. And so when we believe that we can overcome difficulties and cope with our own lives, we're much better able to bounce back from trauma than if we feel like our lives are completely controlled by others or that things just keep on happening to us. And so it kind of help to shift that notion that we are defined by our trauma, right? We actually do have some control. And we don't necessarily feel this naturally over our lives, especially if we've had a lot of difficulty and trauma, a lot of loss maybe that we've experienced. And so we may have very good reasons for feeling like we don't have control, but we can build this sense of mastery over our circumstances, and we can support our youth in developing the belief that they do have control, and we can help them see that they do have choices. And so we can really help support by creating opportunities for them to build skills and to develop that sense of control over their lives in making decisions and good choices. And we can start at a really young age. So one way of doing this is really providing opportunities for youth to share their voice, to empower them in this way and offer them choices and allow them to make those choices. So our youth impacted by trauma often experience a lot of loss of power and control, and through experiences of trauma, as well as through treatment services sometimes that they receive, often the provider takes the approach that they know it's best, and that the child is again in a situation where things are happening to them rather than that integration of their voice and their needs and their wants and desires. So there may be situations where youth might perceive that an adult is trying to control them, kind of a trauma reminder situation. So, for example, a youth that I worked with, whenever he was given a direct instruction, he would go into a tantrum or get really upset. And it was just that sense, that perception that an adult was trying to control him. And so we learned over time that that was a trigger for him, and then intentionally integrated the use of choice and wait time so that he could feel more in control, make a choice on his own, given a little space and time to make that. It was a really helpful strategy for him. And it's not that we want to always to not support him in being able to receive an instruction and be able to handle that instruction, but we wanted to meet him where he was at and be able to give him that sense of start to feel success, and then slowly work towards building tolerance for being able to accept instructions. So we just really want to be able to intentionally create opportunities for our youth to make decisions, contribute their ideas, their input, honor those, honor that input by using it. And we're supporting building control and maintaining their felt safety in that way. So I'm going to move forward, looking at the time. Our next protective factor, excuse me, is executive functioning and self-regulation. And these are actually skills that can be taught as well as contribute to, once we sort of learn them, it's another aspect of developing a sense of mastery and control. So it really, executive functioning is using that ability to use our cognitive abilities to plan, to stay focused, to be able to follow instructions, to be able to balance multiple tasks at the same time, to think about the consequences of our actions, which can include envisioning the future and also controlling our impulses. And then self-regulation, so that's kind of that mental piece. And then the self-regulation is developing an understanding of what's happening within us internally. So what are we feeling? Understanding where those feelings are coming from, how they show up in our brains, our bodies, our thoughts, our actions, and then developing strategies to help regulate those feelings and to express them. So, we're not born with these, but we do have the ability to develop these skills. Ideally, we start very early on through our relationships with our caregivers and other adults. So when children are supported by adults who make them feel safe, they're able to practice and improve these skills through play and social interactions. And we can also promote these skills by providing, regular routines, modeling these skills, socially appropriate social skills and behaviors, and engaging in supportive, trusting relationships with our kids. And I do want to mention one resource here. Oops. That is one specifically focuses on supporting both executive functioning as a part of overall competency and also self-regulation. And it's a resource called Attachment, Regulation, and Competency. It's a trauma treatment model developed by Drs. Christine Kinneberg and Margaret Blaustein, designed for youth ages 2 through 21. And there's a lot of activities and exercises that can be used to support self-regulation and these executive functioning skills. I just wanted to note that resource. One of the activities that falls under, developing that executive functioning is really working that, prefrontal cortex and working on some problem solving exercises. And walking through, this one walks through a youth through first noticing that there's a problem, sort of stopping and engaging in some self-regulation so that they can calm themselves down, getting that limbic system to settle, and then going into thinking through the problem, identifying what they're feeling, saying what the problem is, making choices, maybe stopping to analyze different options. So what are some, maybe 3 advantages to this option? What are 3 disadvantages to this options? And then thinking about the outcomes that these options might have, and then making that choice. But when just being able to stop and reflect on an issue starts to, one, sort of acts on our self-regulation aspect where we're calming down, and then engaging our prefrontal cortex to actually analyze and think through the problem. So regulation and our cognitive abilities working together to control the impulse and then make good choices. And our next one here, another example of self-regulation. Here's some resources for you. We had talked earlier about how our youth and children impacted by trauma can really struggle with being able to self-regulate. And I think it's that understanding what's happening internally, knowing where it's coming from, being able to have some ability to manage it. And so here, and I see, what was the resource called? So here's a list of resources, one being attachment, regulation, and competency. And that's the one I mentioned that talks also about not only this regulation piece, but also competency, which includes executive functioning, self-development, and identity. But there's some others here. Bounce Back for Classrooms is, it's a trauma-informed social emotional learning curriculum that really teaches our youth about stress and trauma and grief and how normal those things are for us human beings. What are some common reactions to those more traumatic experiences? And then kind of a host of coping strategies around self-regulation, and also reframing our thinking, and some help-seeking skills in there. And the students' trauma and resilience is another one. All of these are on our website if you're interested in finding out a bit more about it. There's also an intervention here, cognitive behavioral interventions for trauma in schools for American Indian youth. So different levels of intensity in terms of curriculum that we can use to teach all, and then more trauma-focused intervention that requires a mental health professional. So just some good resources there for you if you're interested in following up in terms of supporting self-regulation in our youth. And our website is there, nnctc.org. And we have, we're going to shift over to Veronica to talk about another protective factor.
All right, so we're gonna wrap up with the last protective factor that we're covering today. And I think it's important to mention this protective factor because the other 4 protective factors that we covered are effective with tribal youth, but they're also effective with all other youth as well. So research tells us that they help to buffer against the effects of trauma for all young people. But for this protective factor, it's unique to tribal youth because, as we know, tribal peoples are unique. And so there are over 570 federally recognized tribes, and even more state recognized tribes, and even more tribes that have yet to be politically recognized in that way. And so we know that there are so many different tribal cultures, there are so many different languages. And when young people, Indigenous youth, are connected to their tribal community, to their tribal identity, their spirituality of their people, the culture of their people, then that provides another layer of protection from trauma that is unique to them. So someone mentioned earlier that sense of belonging, and that's that's, at the core of what makes this protective factor so effective is it helps tribal indigenous youth to have a sense of belonging. It helps them to have a sense of identity. It helps them with their self-esteem. It helps to teach them. We talked about executive functioning and self-regulation skills, but there's actually through cultural practices that Indigenous youth can learn those skills through culture, whether they're learning traditional games, whether they're learning some oral traditions, some stories of their tribes. All of these can teach them executive functioning and self-regulation skills. They can help them. They could be learning their kinship systems. For example, if their tribes have societies or clans, clan systems, when they're learning those things, they actually can help with that relationship building because they can feel a sense of connection through those kinship systems that they are part of. And so there's just many ways in which culture and um, spirituality of tribes can actually bolster the resilience of tribal youth. And so we're seeing more of that in research as well. Although less researched, it is an area that is growing and that we are seeing some of the empirical evidence for that. We don't have time to watch this video, unfortunately, but I do want to make mention of it. I'm going to put into chat an organization called MAPS Media Institute, and it's actually Montana based, but they do they work with young people in after school settings during summer programs, as well as during the school day, where they help them learn some videography skills and other types of STEM skills. And so they actually developed this video with a group of students at in I believe it was in Fort Belknap. And so I encourage you to, the link is on the screen, to check it out. It's about 17 minutes, and it really talks about how in this community, they had a concern about historical trauma and some of the impacts of that, especially as it relates to sexual abuse in the community. And so they really try to reconnect the young people to their culture and help them with some of the cultural teachings that they were missing, that would help them to heal from and intervene in some of the effects of the historical trauma and traumatic experiences that the youth in their community are having. So that's a great video. It's called Looking Forward from Yesterday, and I encourage you to watch it. But I do want to share instead another short video. It's very short. It's 2 minutes. That actually comes from one of our colleagues. Her name is Shannon Crossbear, and she, I want to go ahead and share the website too for that attachment, self-regulation, and competency in case you're curious. I know we put that link in the chat. But this short video just kind of talks about the power of culture and how it works in the lives of Indigenous people. And so I just really thought that this was a good substitute for the MAPS media video. So just kind of out of respect for everyone's time, we can go ahead and move forward with that, but I can put the link of that video in the chat for you all so you can take a look at it. It's a really short one, and it's actually located on our website, and Amy shared our website address, and it's actually part of a blog that we have on our website. And this blog was about one of our curriculum offerings, which is called Walking the Four Directions. And so that's where you'll be able to find that video, but I'll go ahead and put it in the chat. So just for the sake of time, we'll go ahead and move forward. And I do want to make mention, because one of the challenges as a result of historical trauma, including the relocation of tribal peoples in an effort to force them to assimilate into American culture, a lot of our tribal peoples actually were relocated to certain cities in the United States. And so there's a lot of our people that never got a chance to grow up in their own tribal on their tribal lands or in their own tribal communities. And so we have a lot of our Indigenous youth that grew up in urban areas, far removed from their tribal lands. And so we started to think about some of the research has been looking at what can we do for tribal youth that are at a distance from maybe their tribal communities, maybe in the town or city that they live in, they don't have the ability to connect with another person that is from their tribe. And so what they started to do were these peer youth mentoring programs in some of these urban settings, as well as rural settings that that were not on tribal lands. And they would pair Indigenous youth with other Indigenous youth as part of a mentoring program, and they didn't have to be from the same tribe. And what they found was that just by their participation in these mentoring programs, that the young people increased their feelings of cultural connectedness. Even if they didn't get a chance to learn about their own culture, just the opportunity to learn about different Indigenous cultures helped to increase their feelings of being culturally connected. So this is also an effective strategy. For example, if Indigenous youth who may not, because as we know in our school systems, young people are not really growing up learning about their own tribal histories or learning about their own tribal cultures, although there is efforts to change that. And so a lot of times it takes some time for young people, for some young people to have an interest in participating in their own cultural events or practices, especially, you know, within our society today. There's so many other influences and other pop cultural influences that kind of grab our young people's interest. So sometimes it takes some time for our Indigenous youth to begin to be interested in and be committed to learning about their own cultures and practices. And so as young people are developing their identities, that kind of becomes more and more important to them as they grow older. So for the remainder of our time, we have a few minutes here. I just wanted to encourage you to share in the chat, or you can unmute and share what it is that you feel like we can do in your own context, in your own role. From being in this training for the last 2 days, has there been anything that has come to mind, anything that has stood out that you feel like you can do in the role that you're in? Or perhaps you're kind of reviewing some of this material and it's reminding you, or it's making you aware of the fact that there are things that you're already doing that are working and that are effective, and that you want to make sure that you continue to commit to doing in your work. So I just encourage you to share that in the chat or unmute if you're willing to share your voice.
This also might be a good time for some questions if anyone has any lingering questions.
Oh, I really liked what you said about doing some sort of program for youth that are away from their reservation. Because I grew up like practically 4 states away from mine, and it was just me, my mom, and my sister. And I was just a kid. I had no idea where what was surrounding me, no idea. And all the art and everything from the local tribes, it just didn't seem to me that that was real because I was the only native in my school. And when in middle school, I said, I'm native. And they said, you're not native. Natives aren't real, because, it was just not that long ago that that I was in school. Well, like 25, 30, 25, 20 years. And it's just so amazing how much is not shared with just the regular school system, and how all the kids in my class had no idea that how many tribes were surrounding us.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much for sharing that, because I think that's a very real experience. A lot of our Indigenous population, for one reason or another, some of them because of the low and the high poverty rates, have been forced to look for employment off their tribal lands. And so there's a lot of reasons why Indigenous youth grow up away from their tribal lands. And so I think that's definitely something we need to make sure that we are reaching them, and that they feel connected to who they are and to their people. And so thank you so much for bringing that up, and that's something that you are endeavoring to make a reality for the young people in your community. And thank you guys so much for sharing in the chat all the great ways that you feel like you can contribute to the work of bringing healing and building resilience in our tribal youth and our tribal communities and families. I know time is about up, so I'm going to go ahead and close us out. I'll just show you guys this slide. This is something that you can think about after the training. Just kind of go through some of these reflective questions to think about how you can apply what you've been learning the last 2 days, and really take a step of action from the learning that you've been able to be a part of. And so these are some reflective questions that will hopefully help you in doing that. And then we just wanted to share this poem from Tanea Winder. She's an Indigenous poet, and just to kind of encourage us as we set out on our different paths, and as we work to try to bring healing and build resilience to tribal communities, that we are arming ourselves in a good way. And for our tribal peoples, she kind of shares some ways in which we do that. So I'll just go ahead and close us out by reading this poem. Wake up, greet the sun, and pray. Burn cedar, sweet grass, sage, sacred herbs, to honor the lives we've been given. For we have been gifted these ways since the beginning of time. Remember, when you step into the arena of your life, think about those who stand beside you, next to you, and with you. Your ancestors are always in your corner, along with your people. When we enter this world, we are born hungry. Our spirits long for us to live out our traditions that have been passed down for generations. Prayer, ceremony, dance, language are ways of being. Never forget you are put on this earth for a reason. Honor your ancestors. be a good relative. I think it's such a powerful poem because it just reminds us that trauma-informed care, at the root of it for tribal peoples, is just about being a good relative and about that teaching of the 7 generations and about how we can honor our ancestors, as well as work to prepare and preserve and to sustain all of the good things for future generations as well. So thank you guys so much for joining us for this 2-day training. I hope you guys were able to find something that was useful for you and that you're able to put into practice. We just are honored that you've been spending this time with us, and we hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, Amy and Veronica. We really appreciate the time that you spent with us over the last 2 days. We do have a survey and a certificate in the chat. Please do take a few moments to complete that. And there was a lot of great information presented over the last 2 days. There will be a follow-up message going out within the next 2 days. It'll have the recordings for both days of training, the slides, the resources, the additional videos. And if there's anything that you can't find in that message that has been talked about today, do feel free to email us at info@caltrin.org. I'll drop it in the chat. Or, as Amy and Veronica have both encouraged, do take a look around the National Native Children's Trauma Center website. It is a wealth of information, and they are just an amazing resource. So do definitely check that out so that you do become familiar with that resource. I appreciate that you all spent this time with us and made this investment in your professional development over the last 2 days. And we look forward to seeing you very soon. Thanks, everyone.